Hello, class. Welcome. All right. So what we're doing this week is a little different. It's more conventional, right? I definitely prefer the argumentative format, and so I'm not particularly proud of this format, but I won't delve into all the reasons why I kind of capitulated to doing one assignment by way of a video and just simple, somewhat objective answers, questions and answers, right? Not a whole lot of room this week for, you know, personal thought being conveyed. So I apologize for that. That might be rectified, but I thought, oh, what the heck? It's one assignment. And so let's go ahead and do it. So at any rate, on this one, make sure you get the link to the correct video, all right? And we are just simply, I ask you to simply watch the video and answer the upfront questions, okay? So before we get into like the basics of the war, does anyone have any questions or comments? All right. So yeah, so just look into it. And I asked just the basic questions for your command over the material. So notice, right? I ask you who fought the war, what were the proclaimed reasons for which the war was fought. I ask you symbolism, right? Like what seemed what seems to be derived by historians as um, key instances of significance. Okay, no problem. Park, you are Claire, right? All right, so let's see here. Let me make sure everyone has. Okay, no problem, Claire. So one, two. Okay, good. I have everyone. All right, I have all 11 of you. And so I'm going to share the screen. Very upfront questions on the War of 1812. Okay. All right. So who did the U.S. fight in the War of 1812? Be sure, you know, it's a pretty upfront question, but be sure that you get the second party. Okay. We not only fought the British, but we fought their allies, predominantly the Native American tribes, and it didn't fit into a neat category. Oftentimes, tribes like the Creek, especially, they literally split as to those who fought with the British, those who stayed out, and those who even helped us. Okay. So look into that. Okay. Who the U.S. fought in the War of 1812. Also, it's still, you know, there's just enough evidence to perhaps entertain the claims of Andrew Jackson, but certainly not enough to fully substantiate it beyond any realm of controversy. His claims that Spain was giving overtures to the British and to the Native Americans and to runaway slaves, etc., in Spanish Florida, giving their blessing to the fight. In fairness to him, there are a couple instances of intelligence that was gathered from the leaders of Spanish Florida. One was very overt. There was a claim by the Spanish governor at one point that he would help arm the famous red sticks. Red sticks, right, was a euphemism for the Native Americans who put red ochre on their tomahawks when they fought against the U.S. in some key battles, primarily in modern day Mississippi, Alabama, and Kentucky. So at any rate, you have that instance of the Spanish contending that they would help arm the rebellion. You also have to recall that the Spanish, right, had been invaded by Napoleonic France, and Napoleon even put his brother on the Spanish throne, and the Spanish were engaging in a guerrilla crusade, right, like guerrilla, little warfare in Spanish. That's where we get the term. Fighting little warfare against Napoleon's brother and the Napoleonic army in Spain. And yes, the English sent troops into the through the Pyrenees and fought on Spanish territory, helping to liberate the Spanish. So technically, the Spanish were allied to Great Britain, but like I said, some people think that Andrew Jackson and others really stretched that as far as the us contending that we had to fight in Spanish Florida for a reason that you could probably easily guess if you've not been well read on this subject. Coveting of lands, right, and a desire to secure our national territory and boundaries from the Spanish. So you see here we're fighting. Here's a map, right, of some of the major battles. So notice right down at the bottom, we fought in the Mississippi Territory that was not yet ours. And then Spanish Florida, just as the name implies, at that time belonged to Spain. Andrew Jackson is going to go into Pensacola and take it in the course of the year, about 1814. So at any rate, that's something to remember. So, but notice right in the video, look for evidence of the British helping out, arming Native Americans, particularly those under a would-be confederation attempted by Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, generically known as the Prophet. These Shawnee leaders who were trying to amalgamate people from all the different tribes to kick the Americans out. And of course, reasons for which seem pretty obvious. As you notice during the Confederacy, we claimed the land in the Ohio Valley, but the Native Americans, you'll see from the video, it was a very messy jurisdictional situation. The natives fought with one another, particularly the Iroquois were granted that land on paper by the British for their services in the French and Indian War and helping the British in our rebellion. But of course, we didn't want to recognize that until it became convenient. And so the tribes said, the other tribes, the Winnebago, the Miami, these other tribes, they said, I beg your pardon, this is not Iroquois land. We don't care if they claim to have conquered it. So they fought with one another. They had claims that they claimed from England. Some did and some did not, which we at times did and at times did not recognize. And then you add to that like Pontiac and Little Turtle and these other rebellions in the Ohio Valley, right, against the Confederacy and against the administration of George Washington at the beginning of our republic. And then you could make the argument that George Washington, he put in military governors to kind of play the bad guy, if you will. They came in and oftentimes they did not recognize many Native American tribes' claims to their lands. They tried to divvy them out with the Land Survey Office and sell them to squatters and American pioneers infiltrating that territory for obvious reasons. We talked about the whole safety net, or I'm sorry, the safety valve thesis, right? That like with the indentured servants of Bacon's Rebellion, that when you don't have or when you have high expectations of moving up the chain, right, achieving the American dream, socioeconomic ascension, and those dreams aren't materialized, you become disillusioned and possibly a source of rebellion. And so hence it was in the best interest, arguably, of some of these leaders of the early republic to just simply encourage them to move west, get out of their hair, go become the Native Americans' problem, and try to gain good fertile land in the Ohio Valley. And later on, the Ohio Valley is going to serve as the breadbasket. So that's kind of telling of how fertile the conditions and the land was in the Great Lakes area. And so you have those episodes. And then, of course, you had St. Clair and other leaders, right, who were killed against the Native Americans when they were sent as leaders of the United States into the Ohio Valley. And the press ran with that, right, and kind of perpetuated negative stereotypes of the savages in that land. And then you also had people like you see in the video, William Henry Harrison, Mad Anthony Wayne, who played a very good villain to the Native Americans, who were no nonsense, who were intolerant of Native Americans, kind of haughty and arrogant toward their claims, very aggressive in their tactics, not always military tactics, but oftentimes very aggressive in trying to gain their land. All right. And that didn't help when Tenskwatawa started a movement outside of Vincennes, whereby he claimed to somewhat be like just a religious visionary, claimed to have an epiphany with his God, and that God told him to throw out the white man, to unite the tribes, and to return to their Native American religion and culture, etc., and that their God would help oust the white man from that region. And Tecumseh's brother was kind of the military wing to his spiritual side and his ideological side in trying to unite the various Native American tribes against the United States. And there is evidence of the British especially those in Upper Canada, which seems to be a misnomer. Upper Canada is actually geographically Lower Canada, above the Great Lakes, bordering the United States. You do have clear evidence of them meeting with Tecumseh before the war began and arguably making agreements with him, etc. Right? Kind of an old quid pro quo system. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And so, and of course, Great Britain had every reason to want to encourage the breaking up of the United States and the weakening of the United States, etc. Right? So at Tippecanoe, when you see evidence of the weapons were British weapons amongst these Native American red sticks, if you will, the United States Congress will declare, right, that Britain was guilty of fomenting or provoking rebellion amongst our Native Americans here in the U.S. territory. All right. Canada, right? Of course, you have the jingoism that's always been part of American rhetoric, right? The whole kind of manifest destiny that would be spoken and written of in the 1840s, that the United States is a land of exceptional opportunities, of exceptional freedom, and therefore people, it is manifest, it's clear that it's God's will for such a superior civilization to spread its wings and multiply and expand across the expanse of North America. And those who were conquered by the United States and put under the American flag, only a slight paraphrasing exaggeration here, ought to be grateful that the American flag now flies over them, as it will afford them more opportunities, more freedoms, etc., in a superior civilization. So, of course, you had that component. Remember, we tried to invade Canada during the War for Independence and obviously failed then as well. But also, what I found interesting of note in some of the books is that it contends that the American governmental leaders in Congress, etc., and in the State Department under the President, Madison, that they wanted to use Canada as a bargaining chip, right? To quote, win the peace. That if, I mean, first of all, there was a Latin term, I don't remember the term, but it basically means land conquered during the war. That in some cases in diplomacy, at the end of a war, they could agree on this Latin term and say, okay, whatever land was conquered by whomever at the end of this war now belongs to that new conqueror. And then an alternative to that, right, was the status quo antebellum. We'll keep things just as they were before the war, which of course is going to ultimately happen in this War of 1812 against England. So at any rate, you have look for evidence of the invasion of Canada. The video goes over that pretty well as far as that being somewhat of a disaster. All right. And then the obvious reason you'll know from the video, look up the Leopard Chesapeake incident, violations of our international rights as a neutral nation to trade with whom we pleased. The Orders of Council was passed by the King of England and Parliament, whereby they arguably violated the rights of neutral nations during these Napoleonic wars, these continental wars, and confiscating the property of any merchant, any private merchant who was trying to sell anything to the continent of Europe, to Napoleonic France or Europe, right? And remember, it's going to be codified during the Crimean War, just about another 50 to 60 years from here. But still, by this time, you'd already had international councils. You had the legacy of the Catholic Church and its just war doctrine on proper ways to fight the war and proper ways to treat non-combatants and neutrals. And so, arguably, although it was not yet codified and there was no UN or anything like that, it was widely respected as a notion of international law, right? That you could trade non-contraband, non-military equipment to one or either belligerent side fighting a war if you declared neutrality, which we technically were neutral in these Napoleonic wars. And so, at any rate, that was the second reason for which we claimed we were fighting this war. But note also, as you have the component of the Democratic Republican Party, right? Jefferson's party, arguably, informally. This party, right, was openly imperialistic in its platform. They were all for and perfectly fine with taking over Western lands. Okay. And again, you're going to see this very acutely during Andrew Jackson's period. A lot of it was kind of a quid pro quo thing. They wanted voters to elect them into office, and they promised voters what they wanted: land, right? Free or cheap, available, fertile land. And that land was almost always to the west, right? Because a lot of the best seats of the House proverbially had already been taken on the East Coast. And so there was that component to it. There was the Jeffersonian, romantic vision of the ideal farmer. Technically, he talked about the subsistence farmer, the farmer who grew his own food and was not economically in need of anybody else. But by this time, it had kind of morphed or evolved into the small scale cash crop farmer who grew one particular crop and tried to sell it at the market in his quest for the American dream, right? His entrepreneurial quest for improving his station, his lot. So at any rate, you have those components. There was resentment and competition with the as kind of a lobbyist group, if you will, the what Madison would call the faction of the Northeast, right? Remember, a faction is a group that shares the same self-interest and or beliefs. And the Northeast, right? The bourgeois faction, according to David Hackett Fisher's book, was very strong up there, especially in the New England states and New York, et cetera, and Pennsylvania. And so you also see a component to them where some of their speeches in Congress, some of their writings convey the cynical conclusion that they too were against imperialism and spreading west for a selfish reason as well, that they didn't want to lose their influence over the federal government. And they knew that that influence would become, quote, diluted if new Western states were to open, because remember, every Western state would automatically be given 2 senators and 1 House rep for every 30,000 civilians. And so now with these new Westerners, et cetera, the idea was that they might join with the Southerners as a Southern faction, because they would be agricultural in their pursuits, as the Southern representatives seem to embody in Congress. And so they might become their allies and outvote the bourgeois New Englanders and Northerners in Congress on any given issue of economic importance, especially. So the Federalist Party was anti-imperialism. It was even anti-War of 1812. And of course, another cynical thesis that it was because it was disrupting their trade. The northern states, their economy, their prosperity was highly tied to mercantile interests, right? Trading interest across the Atlantic Ocean into the Caribbean, into Europe and Africa, et cetera. And that this war, right, was going to bring about, for instance, the British blockade system, right, where they would blockade, they would go after private merchants with a vengeance, rather vindictively, to try to stifle us and stifle our trade, et cetera. So you have those selfish components to this war as well. But you also had a lot of romance, right, with kind of court history fashion. The argument that we were kind of making our own identity, right? Because remember, through lineage, through traditional institutions like family, culture, education, government, law, religion, we arguably at this early, especially in this early phase of our history, were largely kind of WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, very English in our heritage. And so you see an attempt in many realms at this time of the War of 1812 for us to declare kind of a cultural independence, right? Saying we are not Englishmen transplanted to North America. We are Americans. That is a unique nationality. We are separate from the haughty English and their institutions and culture, et cetera. So you had symbolic things. So, and then of course you also, well, with the symbolic things, let's deal with some of that. Key victories at certain times. And remember, some of these victories were strategically important and some of them were not, right? The obvious case is the Battle of New Orleans, which was fought in early January of 1815. And the war had already been declared over in Belgium at a place called Ghent. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but we decided our 5 diplomats and their 3 diplomats decided to agree on the antebellum status quo. So everything would go back to as it were, territorial wise before the war. So clearly we did not win Canada. The British got out of US territory and recognized our sovereignty, but nothing was really gained, right? But in the Battle of New Orleans, Pakenham and the British and Cochrane, they came in with about 4,000 men into New Orleans, and everything went awry for them. They tried to build a canal parallel to the river, and outside the river, the connecting waterways only allowed very shallow draft boats. We had parapets and forts at key areas to bombard them, and they kind of walked right into fire and were annihilated in the Battle of New Orleans. Also, adding to the legend was how kind of pluralistic the American forces were. They contained free African Americans, ex-slaves, so a decent contingent of African Americans were fighting in that area. Volunteers, of course, the famous ones from Tennessee with Andrew Jackson, and then of course you even had the famous pirate Jean Lafitte, who came and helped out. And so this idea, right, that the haughty, arrogant, mighty British army, some of whom under Pakenham, like Pakenham himself, who would die in this battle, had already been successful in Europe against mighty Napoleon. So it reads like a good David versus Goliath story, right? Where these gentlemen tied to the Duke of Wellington, who had defeated Napoleon in Europe, thought, my goodness, who's this backwater little ragtag army of volunteer militiamen in compared to Napoleon, whom we've already defeated? But they came in and for various reasons were unsuccessful. But the battle was not significant, obviously, because the war was already over, and the conditions of peace had already been decided. So it's basically a superfluous battle, but it brought about a very patriotic wave throughout the United States, made Andrew Jackson a hero that he would ride with politically for decades ahead of this. So that's an example, right, of cases in which things were symbolically important, but not necessarily strategically. Another example, if you'll indulge me, was James Lawrence of the USS Chesapeake. He fought against the HMS His Majesty's ship Shannon of the British, and he died. And his ship, and he famously said, right, don't give up the ship. That kind of tenacity, right, that he was going to fight to his through his dying breath against the British defiantly. You had the case that perhaps was not only symbolic but more strategically significant than that, with Oliver Hazard Perry in the Lake Erie battle, right? His USS Lawrence, named after that guy who died, was on its way down, and a subordinate came in the USS Niagara, and he got on a little boat, a little skiff. And legend states he stood up and taunted the British as they fired at his little boat, as he got onto the Niagara and turned it against the Queen Charlotte and a few other smaller ships, and succeeded. And so we secured Lake Erie, and then also missed opportunities for the British. What we're dealing with now, you guys, is contingency, the what ifs, right? The butterfly effect. Had the British done this differently? Had we done that differently? Could the results have been different? You look up there on this map at Plattsburgh, Prevost, he had an army that was 4 times the number of the American forces going into Plattsburgh. And a lot of people contend that he could have succeeded where Johnny Burgoyne had failed in the War for Independence, and surrounding the New England states and going right in and taking over New York. But he, for some mysterious psychological reasons, he had greatly overestimated American forces. After some resistance, he inexplicably stopped and retreated. And so the whole what ifs of that. And then the what ifs with the American invasion, a lot of the militiamen, particularly from places like New York and Pennsylvania, they refused to cross the Canadian border on principle, that they did not want to fight an imperialistic war on foreign land. And so when we tried our 3-pronged invasion of Canada, as you'll see in the video, it was a fiasco, and clearly was not significant. But of course, right, we went into York, modern day Toronto, and legend states that in the parliamentary building there was an American scalp hanged up at a pivotal place, and it ignited the ire of the American leader, and they burnt the buildings of York, of the capital, to the ground. And there was a town or two, a Canadian town or two, that the Americans put to the torch. And so, of course, right, arguably most dramatically is the British are going to repay that um, with the burning of Washington D.C. They came in right and fought the American forces just outside Washington, and the American forces largely fled. It was a very one-sided battle, and Ross and Cockburn and other British guys came into the British White House and literally dined on President Madison's meal that had been set up at the table, and took their time and then burnt Washington, D.C. to the ground for spite. And then, of course, right after that, they tried to take Baltimore. And Baltimore was a highly symbolic moment for the United States. Most famously, Fort McHenry held its ground. And that's where you get the famous Star Spangled Banner, right? Written by Francis Scott Key as he tried to engage in diplomacy with the British to free a gentleman named William Bean, who they were holding as a hostage and prisoner. So like I said, there was a lot of symbolic value to a lot of this that did not necessarily play into strategic significance, but was of great value. And of course, it was ironic, right, that most of our most heralded uh, victories in our press that gave so much American sense of patriotic fervor and nationalism were on the seas rather than on land, because of the irony, right? Is Great Britain was most known for her naval strength. But you have to remember from the video, right, that they had bigger fish to fry. They were fighting Napoleon back in Europe and in the old world. And so oftentimes they were short on supplies. And we were too, as one case in point with Oliver Hazard Perry and on Lake Erie, with both our leader, oh gosh, his name is eluding me presently, and the British leader of the naval forces on Lake Ontario. There was a long stalemate of no fighting because they were so short on ships. And they literally would try to, they would go back and forth between trying to build ships from scratch as frantically as they could to trying to just simply confiscate the enemy ships and rename and rebrand them and use those, right? And so from that, you could make the argument, okay, well, to what extent was this a premeditated imperialistic endeavor by our congressmen and by our president? Um, if our armed forces were so inadequate uh, at the beginning, especially at the beginning of the War of 1812, so much for really preparing for it. Our armed forces supposedly were only about 6,000 strong, and of course, right, we tried to immediately pump that up to at least 35,000. So, at any rate, going back to this, are there any questions, you guys? Any comments before you or as you were working on this assignment?
Yes, I have a question.
Sure, Josh.
Are we do we are we allowed to only answer in like question form, or do we should we suggest in like a short answer like slash paragraph kind?
Yes, if you would. That's a great question, Josh. If you could do the latter, please. If you could
Okay.
engage in just kind of a short, just at least a few sentences answer to
That's what
each
I
of them, I would greatly appreciate that.
that's what I was thinking. Thank you.
No problem.
I also have a quick
Yes.
question. So, when we do it, do we need to know the questions? So, should we write those all down, or will there be an assignment with the questions listed that we need
Yes,
to answer?
yeah. As you see here, right, and sharing the screen again, when you go to the assignment on Canvas, you should see this right here. You should see those 10 questions, and you should also see the link to the precise video that I want you to watch.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So, like I said, I'm not particularly proud of this format. It's very old school. Intellectually, it's very superficial. It's not like your argumentative assignments. So it's unique in a way. It's more tedious. In a way, it might be more time consuming in watching the video and deriving the answers from it. And on the other hand, it should be easier because it doesn't strain your thought to analyze and evaluate the thesis of a section. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have a question. So
Sure.
about how Canada was related to the war. was the main reason was because of like that they wanted to maintain their freedom in their borders?
Yes. Now that absolutely, as far as court history goes, as far as the contentions of the Democratic Republicans, who were largely the party that was for this war, absolutely, that they claimed that our territorial integrity, our safety, was vital, right? Uh, Vitally a part of the reasons for which we fought this war. And when you look around, we were a very economically precarious country, um, militarily weak country here at the beginning, right? It's like we were like a toddler, or perhaps just a little older than that, but a child going toward adolescence, right? As far as our economic and military development. And when you look around, the British had not made good on their promise in the Treaty of Paris to get out of the Great Lakes region and evacuate their forts. They were still kind of bullying us with the Caribbean and trade in certain key areas. And they were definitely bullying us as far as our neutral rights on the high seas, as you'll see in the video. And then also the Spanish. Quite early on, they deprived us of transit along the Mississippi, and people were contending that the Mississippi was the lifeline, the economic lifeline of ours, because this is before, right? We had developed infrastructure. We didn't have, a canal system, a road system, much less a railroad system. Later on, a freeway system, right? And so you can make the argument that the Mississippi was very vital to our economic well-being. And although we had bought the Louisiana Purchase, right, President Jefferson's administration, the Spanish were still there, as you see here, in present-day Mississippi, Alabama, known as Western Florida, and Eastern Florida, Florida itself. And you also had the component that you had De Mose. De Mose was a fort where the Spanish allowed runaway slaves from American Georgia to come in, and if they convert to the Catholic Church and Christian faith, they were granted freedom and asylum and refugee status and protection in Spanish Florida. You also had, of course, what would happen just after this war, the Seminole Wars with the Seminole tribe, and them fighting and then going back across the border and using the border of Spanish Florida as a protective haven uh, over which we were not legally allowed to cross and fight them, right? So you definitely could make the argument um, that our territorial integrity and protection was at least partially at stake at this early juncture of our history. And of course, the Democratic Republicans and those who were called the war hawks for this war, right? They greatly emphasize that for sure.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So anyone else, any other questions or anything with which I need to be familiar? So
I
at this time,
really,
go ahead.
I really enjoyed the video though. I really enjoyed watching the video.
Oh, good, good. That's great. I appreciate that. Yeah, to non-history, aficionados, you might at times be a little bored. It's a little dry with, it's detailed analysis of many battles, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, as a history nerd myself, I think it's very interesting, and I'm glad you do as well. Um, Another thing of note, right, is the whole nullification debate that will be largely instrumental in the Civil War and the coming of the Civil War. This really reared its ugly head at this time during the war. Is the Federalists in the New England area, right? They had a famous Hartford Convention in Connecticut, and only about 26 guys were a part of it, but they had no one write any minutes of what transpired in that convention. They had one particular guy of note, Timothy Bigelow, who was known for his fiery rhetoric of seceding or leaving the Union, right, separating from the United States. And so the press ran with this kind of, uh, mysterious, right, secretive atmosphere, and it really inflamed the fears and the anger of a lot of American people of that generation, right? And kind of helped out the Democratic Republicans in their cause. Because remember, the Federalists were calling this Mr. Madison's and the Democratic Republicans' war, because they themselves largely didn't want it. And so it was largely seen, right, that their intentions at the Hartford Convention were nefarious, were secretive, dangerous, right, even treasonous during this time of war. Especially when you have something as as emotionally polarizing as the and threatening as the Capitol itself burning to the ground. So oftentimes, right, people who were not for the war, like John Adams, for instance, the Federalist John Adams, who was the second president, once the war began, he changed his tune and said, okay, now we're in war. Now it's about patriotic fervor and winning it, right? So it really did a disservice to the Federalist Party, this Hartford Convention, whatever they did or did not advocate. And by the way, what they were willing to publish were a series of about 7 amendments that they wanted to the Constitution. And when you look at those amendments, it becomes a lot of very clear to some people, right, that their preoccupations, their concerns and desires were not patriotic, were not American in scope, but they were largely regional, economic, and partisan for their own party in scope instead, right? Um, so they didn't want they were against the idea of a draft, and it really wasn't so far as what you're going to see in World War II, as far as a comprehensive draft, right? But a quasi demand by President Madison's administration that there be a certain number of militiamen that are drawn up under each state's government, right? And so they were against that. They wanted largely a 2/3 majority to be required instead of a simple majority, right, of 50% plus one of congressmen. They wanted it more difficult. They wanted a super majority to be okay with utilizing their troops, with taxes, collecting taxes, and other things, right? And so, again, I wish I could find it as quickly as I need to from this book. I'm largely on this class's occasion delving into the 1812, The War That Forged a Nation by Walter Borneman, Borneman. I'm utilizing largely his source. So representation and direct taxes should be apportioned only amongst white free persons. So that was a dig at the 3/5 clause, right? Again, kind of showing selfishness. They weren't making a stand against slavery. They just didn't want a slave to be counted as 3/5 of a person when it came to representation in Congress, because that gave more representation, more representatives numerically to the South, and being able to count each slave as 3/5 of a person, right? New states added to the Union should require a 2/3 majority in Congress, not a simple majority. So again, it was clear they didn't want new states because the new states would dilute their power and influence over Congress, because now these new states would be given 2 senators no matter what and a rep for every 30,000, right? 2/3 as far as any interdiction of commerce with foreign countries. So again, that looked selfish. That they were saying, right, they wanted it more difficult for Congress to pass by now way of a 2/3 majority for them to issue something like the Non-Intercourse Act that Congress had made just before the war, and the Embargo Act declared by Jefferson, that they could not trade with foreign countries at given times and under certain circumstances, because again, it affected their pocketbook. So as you look at these amendments that they wanted passed, they looked, in hindsight, they looked very selfish. They looked very partisan, very just only what their faction wanted, right? And then especially when you combine that with the patriotic victory, although superfluous victory, at the Battle of New Orleans, right? It all the more made them look like traitors and selfish partisans. So at any rate, needless to say, none of those 7 amendments were ever enacted. They were not popularly embraced throughout the country. Neither was this convention, and neither were the Federalists by the end of this war. So you're going to have, for this and other reasons, the virtual death of the Federalist Party, and for a while, right, a secession of our 2-party system that had just developed, whereby the Democratic Republicans were the only party represented in Congress and in the major institutions of our government. But what's ironic, right, is while the Democratic Republicans now have all of the cake to themselves, proverbially, right, they are going to begin to embrace certain ex-federalist policies. So how ironic, right? They get rid of their rival party, but then they subsequently embrace some of that rival party's platform, right? And the solution to which, the explanation for it that I'm going to give you, that you read time and time again in the books, is not going to intellectually satisfy you. But one of the main reasons was patriotic pragmatism, right? Is that the War of 1812, with the blockade being so effective at times along our Atlantic coast, that the blockade was so successful, our road system and infrastructure was so pitiful that it really highlighted such to the entire country. And they decided that practically, pragmatically, patriotically, we need to embrace some of Alexander Hamilton's system. We need to build a road and canal system, right? Connecting market to market, region to region. We need to develop our own industries so we're not economically dependent upon other countries for our basic goods, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to be known at the end of the war generically as the era of good feelings in the late 18 teens and early 1820s. All right. So, are there any other questions or comments?
I have a question, but can I ask you after class?
Of course.
Thank you.
No problem. All right. Anybody else? All right, you guys. So again, if you have any questions, also, I'm going to send out an announcement, but I believe this week you are to have a quiz. So I'm gonna announce that. I'll be sure that when I post that, I will accompany that with a Canvas announcement. All right. So make sure that if you have any questions, just ask me via Canvas message. Otherwise, as usual, you have till Sunday evening to do this. And please make sure you do the quiz as well on the same subject. All right. So if you would, guys, go ahead. I'd like to say goodbye to you, and with the exception of Caitlin, and so that she could ask me her question. And you guys have a great week, okay?
I have a question.
Sure.
So what specifically is the quiz going to be on?
It's going to be from the textbook on the War of 1812, at least from that chapter, the late Jeffersonian and Madison era. Right.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
So, my question, because I sent you a Canvas message,
Sure.
and I was asking if you teach the History 105 during the summer.
You know what? Do you mean perhaps 102 or?
No, I think I'm going from 101 to 105.
Okay. Yeah. To be honest, Caitlin, I would love to have you, but I have not had, I don't think I've ever been given 105. While I would love to branch out, I've been somewhat pigeonholed into 101 and 102. That seems to be the only classes that are ever offered me.
Okay. Do you know who the teacher is? Or
Gosh,
teacher?
I couldn't tell you. I'm so sorry. Sadly, I beg your pardon, but I ask you, what exactly is the title to 105? What's the subject?
Here, let me look at the paper.
Is it 20th century American history?
It just says History 105. Not exactly sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry. All I could tell you to be more specific is I couldn't more highly recommend the full timers. If any of them are teaching, and I don't say that for lack of confidence in the adjuncts. I myself am an adjunct, but I'm only familiar with David Seymour. Trying to think of anybody else that I'm familiar with that Hans Hasselman. Either of them, Seymour or Hasselman, is great. And of course, Al Smith, Bill Newell is a rock star at the school. Smith, Newell, you can't lose with any of them. Eva Moe, Curtis Martin. So yeah, by all means, I'm sorry. I couldn't even tell you what 105 is. So
I
they've
think I
never
just
offered it.
I found what it is. It was Western civilizations.
Okay. You know what? A lot of those that I had just mentioned were American historians. And so I am so sorry. I can't think of a single person
It's okay.
who regularly teaches Western civilization that I know of. So I'm sorry, Caitlin.
It's all right.
I
Thank
wish I
you
could
for
be
your
of more
help.
help.
Thank you.
All right, have a good day, okay?
You too.
Okay,
Bye
bye-bye.
bye.